So this topic is called control and communication, and it's all about how the brain communicates with other body parts, how body parts communicate with other body parts, and it's split into kind of two areas. The first part of that is the nervous system, and then the second part is the endocrine system. So this video is going to cover a few points related to the nervous system, how information flows through it, and how the brain is involved with the nervous system as well. So to start off with, as I've said, there are the two communication systems. So just so we've got an idea of what we're talking about. The nervous system, this is where information is sent via electrical impulses through the nerves in our body. And it involves communication between the brain and the rest of the body. And this is quite a fast method of communication because these electrical impulses travel at really fast speeds, as we'll see later on. The second system is the endocrine system. And this is where information is sent via chemical messengers, which are called hormones, and they travel in the bloodstream. And this is a slower method of communication, so information takes time to get, takes a lot longer to get from one place to another, but that's usually deliberate. It's because we don't want responses to happen quite as quickly, perhaps, as we would with this system here. So what we're going to try and cover in this video is the three main parts of the nervous system, two parts that make up the central nervous system, and the three main parts of the brain and what they do. We're going to look at how information flows through the nervous system. We're going to state what a synapse is and describe how electrical impulses can travel from one nerve to another nerve. So to get us started, we need to kind of define what the nervous system is made of. So it's made of the brain, spinal cord, and then the rest of the nerves. And you can see the brain and spinal cord here have been put in a different color in this diagram. These two things alone we call the central nervous system, which we can see here. So the central nervous system is the brain and spinal cord, but they then have to communicate with other body parts by sending impulses through these extra nerves, these peripheral nerves, which travel around the body. So we call these nerves the peripheral nervous system. They have to connect to the central nervous system for the whole thing to work. So let's take a wee look at the brain then. So the brain has three key areas. The first of these is called the cerebrum. Then we've got the second part, which is towards the back, the lower back part of the brain is the cerebellum. And then the lower front part of the brain is called the medulla. And the brain connects to the top of the spinal cord directly. So that's why we consider this and the spinal cord the central nervous system. So let's take a look at what each of the parts of the brain do. So the top part, the cerebrum, is the largest part of the brain. It's highly folded area of the brain, so it has a really large surface area, and it is packed full of specialized nerve cells or neurons. And we'll look at what those are later on. The cerebrum's job is it's responsible for our conscious thoughts, our reasoning, memory, emotions, intelligence, our imagination. This part of the brain is the most unique part to you. Nobody will have the same cerebrum as you. We all have our own thoughts, our own responses to particular situations, and our own memories. So even with identical twins, for example, they will not have the exact same memories. So the cerebrum inside all of us is wired in a very unique way. The cerebellum is the bit that's at the lower back, and this part is responsible for controlling balance and coordinating our movement. So it receives information from our sense organs, which we'll look at later, and it then helps coordinate our movement and our balance. And then the last part is the medulla, and this is found at the top of the spinal cord, and this transmits electrical impulses directly to the heart and lungs to control our vital functions. So our vital functions are effectively controlled by the medulla. Heart rate, breathing rate, things like peristalsis, which is involved in our digestive system, So all of our vital functions, the medulla is kind of taking responsibility for. When you're asked what the medulla is responsible for, it would be enough to simply refer to the fact that it controls heart rate and breathing rate, because these in many ways could be considered perhaps the two most important sort of vital functions. Okay, so the senses have to detect what's going on around us. It picks up information and it then helps us process information to help us respond in an appropriate way. So we can see the 5 senses here. So our vision, the key sense organ for our vision then is going to be our eyes. Hearing is going to be the ears. Smell through the nose. Taste through the tongue. And then touch is through our skin. And perhaps the most sort of sensitive areas of the skin in terms of touch would be our hands. They've got a far greater number of sense receptors on the surface, and so they are better at detecting things like texture and temperature, perhaps in other parts of the body. But the skin does have these sense receptors all over it. So have a little think about how you would respond if you see or smell your favorite food. So if we see our favorite food, it's obviously going to involve the eyes. If we smell it, it's going to involve the nose. They are sending that information to the brain, but it's then the brain that will make the decision about how we respond to that. Chances are you're going to go over and eat it. If you have something thrown at you, your eyes are picking up that information. If you touch something very hot, that is going to be the skin that's detecting that. If you hear your favorite song, obviously it's going to be your ears, your hearing. But the response, how we deal with that, is carried out by the brain. The brain has to decide what we're going to do, and then we respond appropriately. So how is information passed through the nervous system? Well, the messages are passed from one neuron to another by electrical signals, and it happens really, really fast. So you can see a sort of computer-generated image here of what it might look like. You can imagine that this is a neuron, perhaps in the brain, and that neuron is then it's firing off impulses which travel along these special fibers, and they then pass on to another neuron who will then respond to that information. As I say, it happens really, really fast. So the actual speed, as a bit of an estimate, is an average speed would be about 223 miles an hour. That these impulses fire along our neurons. So that's faster than an F1 car. The signal travels from neuron to neuron by chemicals. So when the signal reaches the end of this fiber, the end of one neuron, it has to then cross a little gap before it can then move on to the next neuron. And there's chemicals that are involved in moving the impulse from one neuron to the other over the gap. But we'll have a look at this in a bit more detail later. So have a little think about this statement here. And what we're going to do is we're going to read this statement. You can pause it, read it yourself, and have a look at this diagram, because we're going to have to try and put parts of this story into this diagram. So once upon a time, Mr. Hill sees a pie. Pie. It looks good and it smells good. And the information is sent to Mr. Hill's brain, where he remembers eating pies before. And he does like pies. I make the decision that I'm going to eat the pie, so I move towards the pie, pick it up, and eat the pie. We do like pie. And everyone lived happily ever after. So in this little story, what was the stimulus? What was the receptor that detected that stimulus? And then the decision that's been made, what is the effector? And what was the response? So in the story, the stimulus itself would be the pie, and the receptor would either have been the eyes or the nose, because we can see it says it looks good and it smells good. So both of these will have actually been involved, and they will have sent the information to the brain along this sensory nerve or sensory neuron. The interneurons that are in the brain remember the fact that Mr. Hill likes pies. And then they decide he would like some of that pie. So it sends a response. It sends an impulse. The brain sends an impulse along one of these motor neurons to the appropriate effector. And the effector here is likely to be his hand, so that he can pick up the pie. So the hand responds by moving towards and picking up the pie, putting it in his mouth, and the response is that he has eaten the pie. So, bit of an odd story, but just gives us a little bit of an idea about how a stimulus has to be picked up by receptors, perhaps more than one, who send information to the brain. The brain deals with that, responds to that information by sending out a nerve impulse along motor neurons to appropriate body parts to achieve a desired response. And this pathway is involved in all of our responses and how we deal with the world and the environment around us. We detect stimuluses and we respond to them. So a couple of questions just to have a wee think about then. These will be in the consolidation document that will come with the video. However, you can just pause the video just now, give those questions a go. We'll not go through all the answers just now. That is something that you will discuss with your teacher in an online video meeting. So feel free to pause the video. When you're ready, you can move on. Okay, and then the next question is to try and put the following into the correct order. So think about the diagram which we've just seen. Okay, so we're going to take a little more, take a look at a little more detail on neurons then and how they actually work. So remember, we learned in a previous topic that cells can become specialized, and when they become specialized, they may change their appearance, and their appearance is usually a structural adaptation to help the cell do what it's supposed to do. So nerve cells are neurons, and the nervous system consists of about 100 billion neurons, and 80% of those are found in the brain. So the brain is a really densely packed organ that is made up of neurons. Now, information is passed from a neuron to neuron by an electrical impulse. So this cell here has quite a few different parts. We've got dendrites, which are up at the top of this neuron, and then we've got the axon, which is a large fiber that is coming away from this cell, and that is going to connect to other cells. So what will happen is these dendrites will receive a nerve impulse from another nerve. It will travel along the fiber into the cell, and then it will travel down the axon, and the axon will connect to another neuron. Okay, and all nerve impulses follow that route. They come in through the dendrite, pass through what we call the cell body, the bulk of the cell, and then along and down this axon. Now, neurons come in various shapes and sizes, but they've got a similar structure to this. And there are three types of neuron that we need to be aware of. So the first type of neuron is called a sensory neuron. These are attached to sense organs, so our eyes, ears, skin, nose, tongue, our ears. And what happens is the receptor, whatever receptor it is, will generate the impulse based on the stimulus, and it'll then send it along a sensory neuron, past the cell body, and down an axon. And sensory neurons then connect onto an interneuron. You can see the pictures here, they are slightly different shapes. They've got the same structures, but they're in a slightly different layout. The interneuron, these are found only in the central nervous system, and their job is to process information that they receive from sensory neurons. And once they've processed that information, they will then send an appropriate response down a motor neuron. And motor neurons will then send that impulse on to an appropriate effector. And usually that effector will be a muscle, which will then cause us to move somehow, or it could be the muscles in your voice box, which change what we say, change the tone, the sound that we make. But some motor neurons connect to things called glands, and they will trigger that gland to release something. So it might be an enzyme in our digestive system, or it could be a hormone that's involved in the endocrine system. We'll find out more about them later. So these are our three types of neuron: sensory neuron, interneuron, and motor neuron. Between neurons, there is a small gap. So we can see this here. So this is the end of the axon. So if we go back, we can see that again. So I want you to imagine perhaps that we are trying to send an impulse from a sense organ to the central nervous system, to the brain. And what will happen is when we get to the end of this neuron, there's going to be a slight gap between this sensory neuron and that interneuron. Now that makes it look like the gap's quite big. It's actually tiny. So this is a better picture here. So we can see that little gap. The name of that gap is called a synapse. So synapses are the gaps between your neurons. Now, when the nerve impulse gets to the end of this neuron, we have to then get that message across the gap, across the synapse. And this involves chemical messages. Their proper name is neurotransmitters. But as long as you're aware that it's a chemical message that is coming from one neuron to the next, it has to cross the synapse. And you need to be able to explain how the nerve impulse may jump from one to the next. So it could be a question that looks a bit like this. Explain what a synapse is and describe how a nerve impulse travels from one neuron to another. So let's take a wee look at how we would answer that question. So we need to first of all say that the synapse is the gap between neurons. So what will happen is when we've got a nerve impulse traveling down a neuron, eventually it's going to reach the end of that neuron. Okay, I'll get to here. As the impulse travels down towards the end, it effectively pushes these little structures here, which are called synaptic vesicles. Now, you don't need to know the name of that, but these are basically, they're kind of like little bubbles within this neuron. And inside those bubbles are the chemical messages that are going to have to cross the synapse. And as the nerve impulse moves towards the end of the neuron, these bubbles are they're attracted, if you like, by the movement of this impulse. They are attracted to the very, very edge of this cell. And remember, a neuron is a cell. So the very edge of this cell, like any other cell, it is a cell membrane. And when these bubbles, these vesicles, push up against the membrane, they join the membrane. And in doing so, the contents of that bubble are released. So this chemical message, this neurotransmitter, is released into this gap, into the synapse. And as you'll remember from one of the topics in Unit 1, when we have a really high concentration of any substance in one place, it will try and move to a lower concentration. And there'll be a low concentration of these neurotransmitters on this side of the synapse. So it's just diffusion, high to low. The neurotransmitters move from the high concentration here to a low concentration here. And when they do that, they join onto the membrane of this neuron. And when that happens, it triggers an electrical impulse to start in this neuron and to move all the way down that neuron, just like happened here. So hopefully that makes sense. So these are the sort of 5 main points. This is what you would need to say. So you should now hopefully be able to describe what a synapse is, the gap between neurons, and you should also be able to explain how the impulse travels from one to the other. And you need to mention these chemical messengers, these neurotransmitters, and how they would diffuse across the gap. Okay, if you need to, pause, take some notes on that, and when you're ready, you can move on. So sending signals down particular neurons and across synapses causes new connections to be formed and others to be strengthened. So the more a synapse is used, or the more a neuron is used and the more impulses it is receiving and sending, the stronger the connections get between this neuron and another neuron. So you can see that there, you can imagine that that point there is a synapse. If we're regularly accessing information in our brain, if we're regularly trying to retrieve information by sending impulses from one neuron to the next, it actually strengthens the connections between them. So when we learn something new, what we're really doing is we are forming more connections between these interneurons in the brain. So what does that mean? Well, it means that learning is hard initially. When we try to learn something new for the first time, it's difficult because we're forming new connections. But the more we try to learn something, the more time we put into it, the easier it actually gets because these connections get strengthened. So think about the work that you're doing, you're revising for a National 5 assessment. The best way to do it is to keep at it, keep revising, keep revisiting things, because it will strengthen these connections. But if we just give up, we won't actually learn. We won't strengthen those connections, and it will make it harder for us to retrieve information from these neurons within our brain. So you really have to stick at it, but revision really does make a massive difference in how we can access information in the brain. Okay, so a few more questions for you to take a look at. Again, these will be in the consolidation document, which you'll get with the lesson. So you can do them now as part of the video, or you can do them later in that document. If you'd like to do them now, pause the video, and when you're ready, you can move on. Okay, so that is it for the nervous system. We have covered quite a lot of information in that. So if we go all the way back to the beginning, what have we looked at? We've covered the three main parts of the nervous system, the two parts that make up the central nervous system. We've looked at the three main parts of the brain and their functions. We've described how information flows through the nervous system and how information crosses that gap, the synapse between neurons. So, well done. The next lesson, we are going to be looking at a particular process that happens within the nervous system called a reflex arc, and how that helps protect our body from harm. But you can now stop the video.